Hey everyone. All right, this is Ari Moshe Wolf. So I'm going to speak about some of the strong Sagittarian Jupiter energies that we got kind of coming together over the next couple weeks. It's an interesting one, and there are several factors. So I'm hoping in this video I can unpack this and just really go a little bit into detail on this with you. So the first thing I want you to look at is we have the upcoming solstice. And of course, this solstice is as well a solar eclipse. It's a new moon happening on the north node. And whenever a new moon happens on a node, it's a solar eclipse. And this is happening, not even just like 4 hours or so after 8 hours or so, or something, or 10 hours, not long after the actual moment of solstice. So it's a pretty potent energy. We have Saturn in an inconjunct to this eclipse point, to this new moon. It's something to talk about for sure, and I think I'll just save that for a different video. What I want to give us attention towards is we have Mars in Pisces right now. As of today, Mars has crossed Neptune, and by the 20th of June, Mars will be at 5 degrees beyond Neptune. And let's progress this a little forward. So I'm going all the way up until June 25th. Basically, by June 25th, Mars at 28:54 minutes Pisces, it comes to an exact square to the nodes. The nodes, which move backwards, being at 29 degrees. So you just progress it a few hours forward, and there you have it. 29:05 Pisces squaring 29:05 Gemini, Sagittarius. So this is 6 days after the equinox, the solstice. And Mars in the last degree of Pisces will square the nodal axis. The ruler of the south node is Jupiter. And Jupiter, as well, is just a few more days from coming into its second conjunction with Pluto. Let's go a little forward, and there you go. By June 30th, Jupiter has passed Pluto for its second time. This is the retrograde transit. It passed Pluto some while ago, a few months ago, when it first went through the latter degrees of Capricorn. So this is important. I'm going to start us off by just giving attention to appreciating that when you have an eclipse point happening, it's a portal, it's an opening, it's a gateway. And so this eclipse happening on the Gemini North Node, but in Cancer, is really emphasizing, also with Mercury just about stationing retrograde, which is the ruler of the North Node, Mercury ruling Gemini. It's bringing a lot of attention towards information, knowledge, examining our self-identity, right? Cancer is self-identity, it's our roots, it's our emotional memories. And when you put Mercury in Cancer going retrograde, it's actually asking us to differentiate between our thoughts and our feelings. And there can be a strong identification with the intellectual constructs that we've created because they're familiar and comfortable to us. So this is really asking us not just to have an open mind, but to also be emotionally self-reflective. We can feel it right now. This is in the air. This is the theme of the times right now. So we're starting off with that new moon solar eclipse on the North Node. And it's important to note that we have Mars during this time, again, passing through Neptune and moving into a tight square with the nodes. By the time we are at the 26th of June. When we address Mars, we're always looking at the cutting edge of evolution. It's like where change is happening. It's where we're making choices. It's where new activity is blossoming. It's where the path is opening for us. And when Mars gets sort of connected to the nodes, it means these are really important turning points where a lot of energy is moving. So it's approaching the square to the nodes as the eclipse is happening. So you can really understand that we're in this theme right now where it's like a pressure point of releasing a lot of energy. Now, what I want to do is go a little in depth into this understanding this Mars and Pisces signature and then really focus on what's going on with the nodes. Because this is the theme we're in right now. And it's really going to be carrying itself strongly through the rest of June. It's a really clear theme here. And understanding Mars' connection to the nodes will really help us understand the higher octave of Mars, which is Pluto, and what's going on right now with Jupiter and Pluto. So Pisces is interesting because Pisces is everything. It's consciousness. And when you put Mars in Pisces, it's on the one hand dissolving the acting function, the choosing function, to become an agent, not of personal egoic narcissistic will, but to do what is necessary, to act. There is this aspect to Mars, which is very much just burning karma. You have to act and you have to do, and that sort of becomes, it's what I call a self-cleaning oven. Action creates a certain field of consequence and effects in life. And what that does is it kind of sets us into the field of living out our internal karmic realities. It helps us play out our interior consciousness. It sets things in motion. If there is nothing on the inside, if there were no constructs of separation and desires for that which is outside of ourself, then there wouldn't be a need to play out this illusion of acting, of using our will, of moving towards something, of fighting towards something. But that is actually very alive, very real, very essential to the Mars experience. And so in Pisces, it's ultimately dissolving that function so it can do what it's meant to do. And there can be this feeling of, one, having no freedom to act. Mars needs freedom, and Pisces is, life, reality, consciousness. So we can have this dynamic of almost like Mars and Pisces can be a boy in school that's bullied. Right? So they're really small and they're really weak. But then they develop their immunity. They realize, I need to develop my skills. So they practice martial arts. They learn how to fight with knives. And then they become, a very powerful, a very strong fighter. And that very powerful and very strong fighter construct itself can become its own illusion of power and, omnipotence and invincibility. And so what happens with Mars and Pisces, it's sort of humbling. It's like you can have a storm of anger and violence and something that just includes all kinds of people, that just really riles everyone up. Or you can have this very strong oppressive energy where it feels like your freedom of movement is being completely confined by forces that are much greater than yourself. What we see happening right now, and this is very important when we understand the nature of the nodes and how Sagittarius and Jupiter corresponds to race. So I'll get there in a moment. But what we see happening right now is we have an uprising of collective Mars energy, expressing rage, anger, claiming the right for freedom, claiming the right to express the hurt and the anger that is the result of systematic racial oppression, fear, hatred, dismissal for hundreds of years. This Mars energy, and you can think of how significant this is, coming to an exact square with the nodes, at the very last degree of the mutable signs, It's almost like it's so existential. It's like everything's dissolving, everything's breaking up. We had this conversation of Mars and Pisces, of breaking up the police force, right? So the forces that operate are being dismantled, are being broken up. And what's on the other end of that? What will come through, as Mars moves into Aries? Well, there's a whole new set of Mars in Aries is going to square all the Capricorn planets. It's going to go retrograde in Aries. We're in the beginning of a process, but the strong mutable energy is sort of bringing up the question, bringing up the dialogue, bringing up the awareness. A lot of vocalization, speaking, awareness, growth. Mutable energy is very much about the dissemination of knowledge, insight, experience, cross-cultural awareness, the way that truth can make itself known anywhere and in anything and in anyone and any time and any place. So this is potent. Yeah, it's really, really moving a lot of energy. But let's give attention to the node. Now, in this particular instance, the South Node in Sagittarius holds a lot of significance. When you have a planet that squares the nodes, there's a natural relationship that it has with each of the nodes. Mars is in a first quarter square, right? Mars is moving into a first quarter square. What that means is Mars has been separating from the South Node. The nodes move backwards. So if you go back in time, you'll see that Mars was, early Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, Sagittarius, and the nodes, was in Capricorn moving into Sagittarius. So they're leaving each other. And then Mars is heading towards the North Node, which is also heading towards Mars. So there is, relative to the South Node in Sagittarius, there is the first quarter square energy, which actually has a lot to do with resolving a paradox along the journey. It's where consciousness needs to go in order to almost free up some energy and bring attention, bring awareness, bring healing, bring consciousness to where there is a crisis in action. All right? How do I act? What do I do now? I've never gotten to this turning point. So this is where the energy really wants to resolve, where it really needs to open up. And so what is the relationship between Mars in Pisces and the South Node in Sagittarius? Sagittarius corresponds to truth. Not truth with a capital T, but it's your individual understanding and the ongoing expansion of your awareness. Likewise, Sagittarius also corresponds to race and culture. And the reason for that is because if you travel anywhere in the world, different peoples from different parts of the world, different cultures, different environments, they will develop a cosmology, an outlook, a perspective on life that is unique to their way of life. Right? A Jewish Orthodox culture, it's a way of life, and that way of life also reflects a perspective, a way of interpreting reality, knowing oneself in relation to the cosmos. Race fits into the same construct. If you're a black person, that's a particular cultural experience. If you're a black person in the United States of America, that's a very specific cultural experience that shapes your outlook and experience of reality. And if you are not of that race, if you don't share in that cultural experience, and we all know, your cultural experience, it's so like, my partner doesn't share the same Jewish experience and background that I have. And so it's like, to explain things that are so innate and natural to me, it's almost like it's not easy, because I don't think to explain things. There are certain things that are just a part of who I am. right? As a Jewish person growing up in this world, there is a certain experience I've had around Christmas time when every store I go in is playing Christmas music, and I would feel alienated and small and unimportant. That is a shared experience that Jewish people have in a predominantly Christian culture, right? Explaining that to those who simply never even realized or thought to think about that, right? It's not easy to do because we all have a different cultural context, a different starting point for understanding our reality. It's so intimate and specific to ourselves. And if you're on a pilgrimage, if you're traveling to a different country, to a different nation, a place where they think differently, they practice differently, they have a different spiritual orientation, you're going to go to their ashram. It's the same idea, right? You're entering into a world where people are talking, thinking, relating from a mindset completely other than your own. When I went to China, everything is different there than in the United States. How people look at each other, how they relate to each other, cultural constructs, how they view the world, right? If in the United States, if you brush up against someone, it's, oh, I'm sorry. Everyone's really apologetic. I notice in China, people aren't really apologetic, and they're not as uncomfortable with sharing tight spaces. So we have to acknowledge that's a big part of Sagittarius. The Sagittarius archetype grows through the appreciation, and this is, a part of the understanding that Sagittarius squares Virgo. Through the appreciation that my cultural experience, thus my outlook, my spiritual cosmology, is shaped by my unique nature, who I am. And so I'm not going to have the full picture. I'm not going to understand your perspective, your insights, and also what it's like to be you. And so there's a humility that's learned in Sagittarius. If there's a willingness to acknowledge, I don't have all of the pieces. I haven't figured all of it out yet. I don't have all of I don't see every aspect of phenomenal existence. Now, the downside to Sagittarius is where consciousness can become diluted in thinking that its way is the only way. And it's so incredibly short-sighted. But can you see if you do this too? If we really look inside of ourselves, we'll effortlessly find that we have a tendency, all of us, to do that. And that's not a reason for shame. It's a reason for humility and self-awareness. In the most extreme examples, we'll have a Christian white male that just assumes that their version of reality and what God is and how things should be is the way. And we could have constructs where certain races or religions or belief systems become the way, better than. That's a big issue within the Sagittarius archetype, where one's unique cosmology or race or way of understanding and relating to reality, one's culture, is taken as the truth. And then there's that Sagittarius fear of the unknown. I don't want to threaten the belief constructs that I've already established linked to what I know. So I will literally feel threatened by whatever is different and is not what I've already established and kind of come to know is true for me. So let's look back at this chart here, because I want to point out a few important pieces here. We have the ruler of the North Node, Jupiter, in Capricorn. So this is going to shape a lot of what I'm speaking about here. With Pluto, you can imagine, with the sort of introduction I've given around Sagittarius corresponding to culture and race, the significance of what's happening right now, seeing where Jupiter is. But before we get to that, let's come back to this Mars piece. Okay, so Mars squaring the nodes, and this really sort of like this focal point, right, being here in the Sagittarius South Node. there's a point of unification where people from all walks of life are called to check their cultural and racial biases and assumptions, the beliefs that have gone unchecked simply due to a lack of sensitivity and awareness of you're not the only one. There are other experiences beyond your own. And the simple reality is, Black people have had a very particular cultural experience, a racial experience that has, first of all, been defined by the delusion of racism. That delusion of racism being created via that Sagittarian idea of, I'm going to treat you differently because you look differently. You're different than what I know, and you have, thus my cultural, religious, spiritual understanding and experience of reality doesn't fit what I'm seeing in you. So that, Sagittarius, Virgo, Pisces is this whole dynamic where we create the whole psychology of better than or worse than, inferior, superior, sadomasochistic, really, where certain races and cultures of people are better than others, and others are inferior to others. And it's always a situation when you find Mars in Pisces, we're going to have the relationship between the underdog, right? Like the one who is historically disenfranchised or bullied, right? And then like the ones that are in power, where energy seems to be the most accessible. And the whole story of Mars and Pisces is what Jesus said: the last will come first and the first will come last. It's about love. It's about unity. Right? Mars in Pisces says we're all equal. No one is more powerful, and no one has the right to use aggression and force and might indiscriminately against anyone else. Now, this is where we go into the whole dismantling of systemic racism. Force is Mars, but the police force is Mars relative to Capricorn. Right? What's protect and serve? Mars. But it's on a national government level, structured. It's meant to operate within a governmental framework. That's Capricorn. So we have this whole dynamic, Mars squaring the node, Sagittarius South Node ruled by Jupiter and Capricorn. We are really, Capricorn, introspecting, reflecting, looking deeply at the history, the conditioning of our racial and cultural biases and assumptions and lack of awareness. The truth is coming out about how there has been a racial oppression built into the governmental system of the United States. The Gemini North Node is data, information, communicating, sharing knowledge. That Gemini North Node, relative, and this is important, to that in conjunct with Saturn, so apparently I'm speaking about it now, and Saturn ruling all of that Capricorn, is asking us, and especially if Saturn's in Aquarius right now, it's going to move back into Capricorn, it's reviewing the history of this country. Truly. I mean, what I'm seeing a lot of people speaking about is, what is the history of racism? What happened when the 13th Amendment was passed and Black people got the right to vote? Was racism gone? What was the actual history? There's a movie called The 13th. Definitely check it out. There are a lot of really great resources that offer history, that speak about the history of slavery and racism. And it's far more complex than, yeah, well, we had slavery, it was abolished, and then there's still some racist people. The way the government itself dealt with the fact that Black people were now legally allowed to vote is they had to find more manipulative, underhanded means to suppress their power and to keep them enslaved peoples. So, unraveling the history, and it's not just the history in this country, it's our own conditioning. This is the important piece. A lot of people talk about, well, I'm not racist, I'm white, but I don't hate Black people, I have Black friends. These are very common responses that we hear from people who are white relative to kind of responding to the topic of racism right now, but it's also something you hear in any situation, right? When there's a sense of, I'm not actively involved in this systematic oppression. But here's an important piece here. It's not about I'm causing it or I'm racist. These are not necessary, and it's not necessary to create guilt. But this Capricorn energy and the Saturn in conjunct to the North Node, and Saturn ruling this Jupiter Pluto, it's saying, Saturn, introspect and reflect on Jupiter in Capricorn with Pluto. Your own unique cultural experience, and thus the assumptions you grew up with based upon your unique cultural experience. Right? To bring it home to an example that I'm familiar with, I appreciate it when non-Jewish people demonstrate a sort of empathy or awareness of the fact that their cultural experience is completely different than mine, and they don't just say Merry Christmas to me, and where there isn't this idea of I'm just going to assume and fit you into a certain box. I also don't care when people say Merry Christmas, because I've come to accept it, and it's not worth losing my peace over. But I've never celebrated Christmas. Well, I guess this year I did, because I'm living with people who do now. But until this year, I've never, one, celebrated Christmas, have never even had a desire or interest to. It's never been a part of my life. So you can imagine what it's like for so many Black people and people of color in general that don't fit into the mainstream white cultural story. Society isn't built to scare you if you're white. I was reading a story recently from a friend of mine that talked about this experience where she got off the bus, she was holding her children in her hand, and the police officer brushed her to this office. They were very harsh with her, very aggressive, and they were questioning her, and she was like, what's going on? And she was wondering if this had to do with her husband, who's an activist. And, time passed by, and eventually they realized they got the wrong person. They were some sort of crime, and they thought that she was her, and it was a mistake. And she reported that during this experience, it was frustrating. She felt angry at times, and at times she felt sort of humored, but she never felt like her life was threatened. This is a white woman with her kids. She never felt like her life was being threatened, not one moment. And she knows, and I know, and we are all coming to appreciate and recognize, if you are a Black person, you are living in a society where it is common to carry the psychology and that sense of I am not safe. Right? If an officer pulled you over, it would be much more common for a Black person to have the fear of, oh no, am I about to be killed? White people will not generally have that fear. And that's a truth. I've listened to so many stories of Black people talking about when they were kids. Even who was the senator from New Jersey who was running for president? I forgot his name, but he was sharing recently on Stephen Colbert that when he grew up, he was told, and he's a big guy. He played, I think, football. He said he's a big, tall man, but very sensitive. He's a vegan, very sensitive, very loving person. He was told when he was young, when you're walking through the street and you see the police, make sure you are acting beyond suspicion. Right? When I pass police, I don't have that fear of like, if I look suspicious, they're going to shoot me or pull me over. It's like, it just doesn't occur to me. In fact, as a child, I grew up, as many, many white people grew up, thinking police are all great people and they're safe. They're here to serve and protect. And of course, I do not believe all police are bad people. And we know that many are, and many are demonstrating a profound solidarity and care for the protests and for the plight of Black people and Black Lives Matter. And police are a beneficial part of society. They do important things. But it was never in my consciousness to be afraid of them. So the conversation about race and culture and really being able to extend and understand these things is a very important part of this Capricornian energy. The Saturn in conjunct to the North Node, to really emphasize this, the nature of the signature. Saturn in Aquarius first, okay, this is where we are right now, and then Saturn in Capricorn. Saturn in Aquarius is liberating from our culture, our collective systems of governments, how we live and structure our society together. And it's asking us to elevate our thinking. What can work better? What is more inclusive for more of us? While Sagittarius and Jupiter correspond to race and culture, Saturn in particular corresponds to groups of people, subgroups and subcultures relative to mainstream society. So that is not necessarily race, but race can be included in that. It could also be a group of people that eats a certain way, right? That has a certain way of living that sets them apart from the mainstream. Any kind of subculture of people is Aquarius. So there's obviously an awareness here of this society needs to work well and function healthily for all groups of people. Now then moving into Capricorn, that in conjunct, so the in conjunct with Aquarius to that Gemini North Node is opening up the mind to consider perspectives that actually might at first feel a little dissociative. That's the in conjunct. It's like, how do I encompass this information? What do I do with this? And it's bringing forth a whole bunch of new ideas and perspectives and information. And then that in conjunct will continue to deepen with Saturn moving back into Capricorn. And that's just really bringing it down into, okay, let's actually address the finitude, specific, legal, structural realities that define how we're structuring government and society. Saturn being in Capricorn for the rest of this year, as Mars will go into Aries later on. He'll need to show you what this looks like later in this year. It's wild. So see, Mars is in Aries right there in August. 1 month later, Mars is retrograde. And it's squaring all of this Capricorn. Jupiter goes retrograde, and then Jupiter goes direct, and then Pluto goes direct, and then Saturn goes direct, all basically in the fall of 2020, leading up into the United States November elections and beyond. So a lot of what's opening up right now is going to be advocated for big structural change. And what can you expect as well? Jupiter, Pluto. Pluto is oppression, right? Pluto is both the force of evolution. Everything needs to evolve and change and grow and regenerate. But it's also that psychology of evil, of darkness, that the forces that want to hold on to non-change and says, I am determining that my power is associated with maintaining the status quo. And Jupiter in Capricorn with Pluto is white supremacism. By the way, I heard a really great point that white supremacy is not a useful term to use. Like, let's abolish white supremacy. White supremacy literally means white are supreme. What you want to abolish is white supremacism, is the ideology of white being supreme. To abolish white supremacy is to abolish whites being supreme. You want to abolish the ideology. I think that's a very important distinction, so I appreciate that. So white supremacism, Jupiter, race, with Pluto in Capricorn, is a structural reality that says this race is supreme, is important, is the boss, is the CEO, is the chief, is the one that is, here. It's also the history of it. It's like they've been the important ones historically, and this transit is saying, get rid of that. It has to die. And there's no way for this to die other than just being willing to look inside. Now, I want to close this video with a few other thoughts. When we really address this notion of introspecting, becoming aware, the starting point, I find, is simply addressing what's in front of us, right? So as a white person, and by the way, I don't walk around day to day thinking I'm a white person, and of course I don't. I don't need to. A lot of black people do walk around day to day thinking I'm a black person, because there is more of a distinction for a lot of black people. There's more of a gravity and a sense of there's a knowing that who I am as a black person has more weight. White people don't need to think every day, I'm a white person. So I don't tend to think about race. And also, as a very spiritually oriented being, my orientation, my movement in life normally, naturally, is to orient towards unity, towards oneness. I don't resonate in my being with thinking of anything in terms of distinctions of race or separation. But the importance of giving reflection to this is seeing, okay, there are many people, my brothers and my sisters on this planet, of a different skin color that have been historically oppressed, hated, feared, and disregarded by entitled authority figures that believe that they can murder them in broad daylight with no consequence. That is a call for compassion, for care, for heartbreak. And that's the starting point. I find that naturally impels me to want to look at myself. How am I participating in this violence by way of me not being aware of my own cultural biases and assumptions? Becoming self-aware doesn't take away from the non-dual spirituality that I care so much about. It actually makes the non-dual more accessible. What's the first step in healing the delusion of separation? Realizing it was created. If unity is my goal, if that's what I care most about, then the first step for me is to realize where in my mind there is not unity. Where my actions, where my consciousness is oriented around a narcissistic, self-oriented, unconscious, unaware frame of reference. And this doesn't mean I have to learn about every culture when I go somewhere or when I talk to someone and make sure I don't say anything so I don't offend them, or that you don't say anything wrong to me because I'm Jewish and you don't. It's not about that. It's just having that space to learn. Right? And when someone's saying to you, I'm hurt, I'm hurting, I've been hurting for a long time, my people have been hurting for a long time, that's where there's I want to learn more. Right? The fact that racism was created means that it's Capricorn, it's structured, right? It's become an institutionalized part of our living, means that we actually need to address it, meet it, acknowledge it, and become self-reflective of how we are innocently participating in it. Okay, so it's not a call for guilt. It's just a natural human function that we are not usually aware of cultural experiences beyond our own if we weren't trained to think in those empathic ways. In this world where we all tend to grow up in these very monolithic cultures where we don't learn about people other than ourselves, this kind of learning is very important. Very necessary. That being a starting point. And 2, take your time to explore it, to feel it, to connect with it. I see a lot of people saying things. If you're not saying something, I'm going to unfriend you. If you're not speaking against the violence, you're not my friend. You're contributing to the problem. And I want to say, I acknowledge, because I see this in myself. Whenever it comes to becoming self-aware relative to the places where we lacked awareness, it might take some time. And defensiveness is a natural reaction. There's this construct called white fragility, which is a new construct for me, but it makes a lot of sense. The notion of white fragility is simply this tendency amongst white people to be defensive. Hey, I'm not racist, I'm not, right? And so there's that tendency. And that tendency is exactly where that self-protection mechanism is keeping an individual apart from becoming self-aware of their own cultural biases and assumptions and lack of awareness. It's just important that we realize no one's doing anything wrong here. And so being undefended and taking the time to learn and to become self-reflective simply says, I care to learn, I care to grow. And I'm willing to look at myself, I'm willing to look at the areas that I was not clear about, that I didn't know I was ignorant. I didn't know that I was hurtful. I didn't know that I lack sensitivity and awareness and appreciation for people that are having a different experience from me in such a profound way. And so we need to grant one another that space and that support to become self-aware. We must not create more division and shame people for not being self-aware. Rather, if you're a white person and you have white friends that maybe are saying hurtful things or are acting unconsciously or aren't saying anything, if you want to, you can engage. Become an invitation. See if they want to learn. See if they want to talk. If they want to open and expand their horizons. It's taken me a little bit of time to start talking about this on YouTube. I wanted to process and collect, more information to sort of reflect on some pieces in me. I've had a lot of conversations with Michelle. I've made several videos that I didn't post. The other thing I want to say is, just because you have Facebook doesn't mean you have to use it. Just because you have a body doesn't mean you have to use it. Just because you have a voice doesn't mean you have to use it. Everyone's journey is what it is. A monk meditating in samadhi, in isolation from the world, is no better or worse than an activist who is using their voice and speaking up. Everyone's path is what it needs to be. It's actually unalterable, and we have to walk that path, and that's what Mars is about. Mars says you have to take the next step. It's not for us to discriminate. It's not for us to judge and say what should or shouldn't be. It's only for each one of us to determine, how am I going to act right now? And that comes back to the deepest core of our spiritual practice. What is the life that I want to live? Do I want to live a life of wellness, of joy, of peace, of wholeness, of togetherness? And that must be the basis for your choice. And it really comes back down to that self-responsibility, which only ourselves can choose to determine.